Welcome back to the Game Collection. I am SuperDerek, and The Secret of Mana is a game that needs no introduction. During the early 1990s, RPGs saw a renaissance in the United States, and the Super Nintendo was at the epicenter when it happened. What is sometimes referred to as the beginning of the golden era of RPGs is inseparably linked to the work done by several talented studios. I've talked about Quintet, Produce, and NX. I've talked about Capcom, Neverland, and Climax Entertainment. But one company was so integral to the surge of the RPG popularity that their name is still synonymous with quality RPGs to this day. Squaresoft. I don't know of a single company more responsible for my infatuation with the Japanese role-playing game than Squaresoft. And thanks in no small part to NX's decision to not release any of the Dragon Quest games in the United States during the Super Nintendo's lifespan, Squaresoft was the undisputed king of turn-based battles. Love them or hate them now, the impact that they had at the time was undeniable, and with so many games still held in such reverence, it's no wonder. And one of these such revered games is Secret of Mana. Shortly after the moderate success found in Seiken Densetsu, Koichi Ishii resumed work on the series that would become his signature contribution to the era. Seiken Densetsu 2, known as Secret of Mana in the West, was released in Japan of August 1993. A localization was rushed to completion for a holiday season release in the United States in October and Europe in November. Ted Woosley famously completed the translation in 30 days. In an interview with Hardcore Gaming 101, he stated that the text space restrictions and the timetable for the translation nearly killed him. In The Secret of Mana, you play as Randy, a young boy who unwittingly drew the mana sword from the stone. Unfortunately, this sword was the weakening seal that was holding back monsters from the countryside. As our hero returns home, he's greeted by a monster attacking his hometown. Despite saving the town from a certain doom, he is cast out from the village, exiled, never to return. However, with the guidance of a Gemma Knight, Randy sets out on an adventure to restore the power to the Sword of Mana. Along the way, our hero makes enemies with the evil empire who is seeking the power of mana for themselves. Fortunately, he also befriends a girl and a sprite who become indispensable allies along the way. Despite the rush job on the translation, the plot of the game is still quite coherent. I've heard, though, that as much as a third of the game's plot has been omitted because of space restrictions, which is heartbreaking. It would seem as though what was left of the plot was mostly utilitarian, as the story you'll experience is pretty lean. An unfortunate consequence of this is that during the last quarter of the game, you're given very little guidance on how to proceed. So I guess what I'm getting at is that if you're playing Secret of Mana for the plot, you're probably going to be disappointed. However, if you want to play Secret of Mana on your Super Nintendo, then... oh. Yeah. Right. Secret of Mana plays really nicely. The game uses a beat-em-up style fighting mechanic with the inclusion of a stamina meter that acts as a sort of active time battle meter. When the meter is full, you attack at full power. If you attack before that, you'll only do about 10% of the damage. As your weapon skills increase, you can use charged attacks by holding the attack button and releasing it once charged to unleash a flurry of attacks. Your companions can use magic to assist in combat by either healing or providing stat bonuses, or adding elemental affinities to your equipped weapons, or just using magic attacks outright. When your minions are not casting magic, the AI will control them to your liking, based on where you placed them on a spectrum. All characters have access to a wide arsenal of weapons, which you can equip and upgrade throughout the game. But perhaps the coolest thing about the game is that you can actually play with a friend, like a role-playing beat-em-up. In fact, with a multi-tap, you could even play with 2 friends. If you have 2 friends. And as awesome as all of that is, I would be remiss not to mention that there is still some room for improvement. The hit detection is sometimes a little wonky. Sometimes when issuing commands to cast spells to your minions, they'll sometimes ignore you. Also, the AI is pretty bad. Even when configured to your liking, they'll seldom perform up to expectation and have no real sense of self-preservation. Also, their pathfinding can be pretty frustrating. Running through a dungeon feels similar to how dragging a couple of anchors across rocky terrain using a bungee cord might feel. Also, use of magic is pretty ridiculous. It's fairly simple to spam magic attacks against bosses, taking them out in under a minute, which can take all of the challenge out of the game, and it can also defeat the purpose of having a second player around. And the opposite is also true. Enemies and bosses can just as easily spam you with magic and attacks, stun-locking your characters, against which there is no defense. When it was released, Secret of Mana was a very pretty game with bright and colorful graphics. However, I don't think that it's aged particularly well in comparison to some later work on the Super Nintendo. In particular, the dithering on the text background can make it kinda difficult to read. There is one way in which Secret of Mana is timeless. The game sounds fantastic. This game has so many tracks that are so iconic and memorable. Very few SNES games can stand up to the soundtrack in Secret of Mana, and in fact, I feel like this is one of the few areas in which the Secret of Mana has truly surpassed Terranigma. The Secret of Mana was the ship that launched the Mana series into notoriety here in the West. There have been numerous games released in the series, including the cult hit Seiken Densetsu 3, which never saw a commercial release in the West. Secret of Mana has also gone on to be released digitally for the Wii and Wii U virtual consoles, iOS and Android devices. Reviewing a game as legendary as The Secret of Mana is a bit daunting. It's been placed on such a high pedestal by the retro gaming community, and to re-examine its merits at face value will likely lead to some heated debate. There's a lot of people out there who draw a line in the sand and say, this is the best action RPG on the Super Nintendo, period. And to cross that line is an affront to them personally. But I have to be honest here. Unfortunately, Secret of Mana just doesn't hold up to the hype set by its fans, but the game can't be held accountable for the overblown expectations that its fans have set. This game was a staple of so many childhoods, including my own, that nostalgia can pretty easily throw objectivity out the window, and that's sort of what's happened here. Secret of Mana is by all means a very good game on the Super Nintendo, and probably one of the best action RPGs for it at that. It has solid gameplay mechanics that could use some refinement, and thanks to a rushed translation, the plot that it has is pretty bare bones and lacks any depth or character development necessary to make any emotional bonds to any of its characters. For all of its shortcomings, Secret of Mana undoubtedly played a huge role in shaping the action RPG as we know it today. It left a lasting impression on an entire generation of players. It brought us co-op gameplay, and it showed us a diverse world that we could explore together. It had a soundtrack for the ages, and it became the standard against which we compared all action RPGs for years to come. In fact, this was the best action RPG that we got on the Super Nintendo in the United States, and despite all of its flaws, this game was a hell of a lot of fun to play, and that's why it's got a spot in the game collection.